Okay, let's go. Number 1. Italy. June 13th, 1933. A telegram arrives at the office of Italian state media, stamped with 2 words that would stay classified for 70 years. Silenzio assoluto. Absolute silence. The order came directly from Benito Mussolini, and it carried threats of arrest and criminal penalties for any journalist who published a single word about what had just happened near the town of Magenta in northern Italy. What happened was this. A bell-shaped metallic craft had come down in the Italian countryside and embedded itself in farmland outside Magenta, roughly 20 miles west of Milan. Not a plane. Not a weather balloon. Not anything in the Italian military's inventory. A metallic object with no wings, no propeller, no visible engine of any kind. And Mussolini's government moved fast. The site was sealed off. The craft was recovered under armed guard. And a total information blackout came down over the entire incident before the sun set. 2 fascist telegrams went out that same day. Both referenced the alleged landing on national soil of unknown aircraft. Both demanded complete suppression of all information about the recovery. And both were sent on Mussolini's personal authority, with explicit threats of arrest and penalties against anyone who broke silence. Journalists were warned directly. The craft was transported to a secure facility, and a team of Italian scientists was assembled to examine it. Nobody outside the program was told what had been found. Nobody outside the program even knew the program existed. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. This was 1933, 14 years before Roswell. A full decade before the term flying saucer entered the English language. Whatever landed near Magenta, the Italian government recovered it, studied it, and buried every trace of the story before the rest of the world even had a vocabulary for what they were looking at. The documents survived because Italian bureaucrats, even under a fascist dictator, filed everything. Those telegrams, those internal memos, the correspondence about unknown aircraft, all of it sat in government archives for decades, classified, untouched, gathering dust in filing cabinets that nobody thought to open. Italian UFO researcher Roberto Pinati spent years tracking down the originals. He published his findings as the UFO Files of Mussolini, tracing a paper trail from the crash site through layer after layer of fascist bureaucracy to a research program that operated in total secrecy under Mussolini's direct supervision. The telegrams have been authenticated. The chain of custody is documented. This isn't a rumor from the internet. These are government documents from a government that no longer exists, preserved because one researcher was stubborn enough to dig them out. And no, I'm not making that up, because in July 2023, a former senior U.S. intelligence officer confirmed it in the most public way possible. David Grush, who had served on the Pentagon's UAP task force and held top-secret clearances across multiple intelligence agencies, sat in a congressional hearing room in Washington, raised his right hand, and testified under oath about a multi-decade American program to recover and reverse engineer non-human craft. He told Congress the U.S. government had recovered non-human origin technical vehicles and non-human biological remains, and that he had been briefed on these programs by over 40 witnesses across government and defense contractors. When asked about the earliest known case of a government recovering a non-human vehicle, Grush didn't say Roswell. He said Magenta, Italy, 1933. He told the hearing his information came from classified briefings and first-hand sources inside the U.S. intelligence community who had direct knowledge of programs involving recovered craft from other nations. A sitting American intelligence officer, under penalty of perjury, in front of cameras and Congress, pointed to a fascist-era Italian crash retrieval as the starting point of a phenomenon that now spans the globe. Think about what that means for a second. The standard timeline, the one that starts with Roswell in 1947 and treats the whole subject as an American curiosity, is wrong by at least 14 years. The real timeline starts in a field outside Milan, under a regime that understood one thing about technology it couldn't explain. You lock it down, you study it behind closed doors, and you make absolutely sure nobody talks. There are claims, referenced across multiple research threads but never fully confirmed, that information about the Magenta craft was shared with Nazi Germany during the Axis alliance in the late 1930s. If true, that means recovered non-human technology was circulating between fascist governments before World War II even started. A covert exchange of materials and intelligence between Allied dictatorships that were simultaneously preparing to redraw the map of Europe by force. And that raises the question that runs underneath every entry on this list. If Italy found something in 1933 and kept it secret, who else found something? How many other governments recovered objects they couldn't explain, studied them behind locked doors, and never said a single word? Because Italy wasn't alone, not by 90 years, and not by a long way. But Italy wasn't the only nation finding things it couldn't explain. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union was building an underground facility to study exactly the same kind of objects. Number 2. Russia. In 1955, deep inside the Astrakhan Oblast in southern Russia, the Soviet Ministry of Defense quietly established a top-secret research group at one of the most restricted military installations on Earth. The facility was called Kapustin Yar. Officially, it was the Fourth State Central Interspecific Test Site, a missile and weapons testing ground built in 1946. Unofficially, it was about to become Russia's Area 51. The research group had one job: study recovered objects of unknown origin. And according to multiple sources, including American spy plane photographs, satellite imagery, and declassified CIA reports, the Soviets had plenty of material to work with. Claims from researchers and intelligence analysts allege that wreckage from no fewer than 8 separate UFO crash incidents was transported to Kapustin Yar between 1945 and 1991. 8 recoveries across 46 years. This wasn't a single incident filed away and forgotten. This was a sustained collection program spanning the entire Cold War. Almost nobody outside intelligence circles heard about this part. The facility sits in the middle of the Russian steppe, surrounded by restricted airspace and military checkpoints. Underground hangars, at a reported depth of 1,300 feet, roughly a quarter-mile beneath the surface, are alleged to store the remains of at least 5 alien aircraft. The claims come from a combination of intelligence analysis and defector testimony, cross-referenced with satellite photographs that show surface structures inconsistent with standard missile testing infrastructure. The History Channel documented much of this in their 2005 episode UFO Files, Russian Roswell, which examined the evidence for Kapustin Yar's role as a UFO storage and research facility. And somehow, it gets worse. Because Kapustin Yar turned out to be part of something much bigger. When David Grush testified before Congress in 2023, he referenced intelligence from foreign nations, including what he described as reporting from a foreign peer adversary about recovered materials and reverse engineering efforts. And Carl Nell, the same colonel who confirmed the 80-year arms race, added that the first nation to crack this technology could destabilize the world. When you put Kapustin Yar into that frame, the scale of what the Soviet Union was doing starts to come into focus. Italy recovered one craft in 1933 and buried the story. The Soviets allegedly recovered 8 objects across nearly 5 decades and built a quarter-mile deep underground facility to house them. They didn't just find something strange and file a report. They built infrastructure, they staffed programs. They allocated resources across generations of military leadership, through leadership changes, through the fall of the Berlin Wall, through the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. That's not curiosity. That's an institutional commitment to understanding something they believed could change the balance of power, and the Americans knew about it. CIA reconnaissance flights over Kapustin Yar in the 1950s and 1960s were among the most dangerous intelligence operations of the Cold War. Spy planes flew over a facility the Soviets were willing to shoot down aircraft to protect. The question is whether the CIA was looking at missiles or whether they already knew what else was stored underground. The Cold War wasn't just about nuclear warheads and ideological influence. If Nell's statement is accurate, and if the intelligence about Kapustin Yar reflects even a fraction of what actually happened there, then both superpowers were simultaneously running a second, hidden competition. One that had nothing to do with communism or capitalism, and everything to do with being the first nation to understand technology that didn't come from this planet. 8 crash recoveries. Underground hangars a quarter-mile deep. A top-secret study group established by the Soviet Defense Ministry. Russia had been in this race from the very beginning. Number 3. Brazil. Varginha, Brazil. January 1996. 3 young women are walking through a vacant lot in the city of Varginha, Minas Gerais. It's a Saturday afternoon in January 1996. Lilian Silva, her sister Valquíria, and their friend Katia Andrade come around a corner and see something crouched against a wall. Brown, oily skin. A large, oversized head, big red eyes staring back at them. It's not an animal. It's not a person. And within hours, the Brazilian army is on the ground. Military trucks rolled into Varginha that same day. Fire department units were deployed to multiple locations across the city. Witnesses reported soldiers cordoning off streets, blocking access to specific buildings, and conducting what looked like a coordinated sweep operation. And according to multiple eyewitness accounts, the military captured at least 2 living beings matching the description the 3 women gave. The creatures were reportedly transported to a regional military hospital under armed escort. What comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense. A soldier involved in the operation, Marco Eli Cherez, died under mysterious circumstances shortly after the incident. His family stated he had direct physical contact with one of the captured beings. The Brazilian military launched a formal inquiry that generated thousands of pages of documentation, none of which were made public for years. And the official explanation from the army? They concluded that a local resident, a mentally ill man known in the neighborhood, had been mistaken for an alien creature by the 3 witnesses. 3 separate witnesses, brown, oily skin, red eyes, a military deployment involving multiple branches, thousands of pages of classified inquiry documents, and the best the Brazilian army could offer was a case of mistaken identity involving a neighborhood resident. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did, not for years. The Varginha case didn't fade away, it grew. Brazilian journalists, local investigators, and eventually international researchers pulled at the threads for decades. Declassified Brazilian military documents were eventually released to the National Archives. In 2024 and 2025, U.S. lawmakers and whistleblowers began publicly urging Brazil to declassify the remaining records linked to the Varginha incident, treating it as a case that could corroborate what American officials were now saying under oath about non-human recoveries. If you want to see where this trail leads next, and it leads to places most people would never expect, subscribe now, because the next country on this list changes the entire equation. The Varginha incident is significant because it's not abstract. There are no radar blips, no ambiguous sensor readings, no lights in the sky that could be explained away as aircraft or atmospheric phenomena. 3 civilians saw a non-human creature in broad daylight, described it consistently, and the military showed up in force within hours. That kind of response looks rehearsed. It looks like a recovery operation the military had already trained for. And Brazil isn't alone in this category. In 1997, during a U.S. military counter-narcotics operation called Operation Laser Strike in the jungles of Peru, a young U.S. Marine named Lance Corporal Jonathan Wygant encountered something that had nothing to do with drug trafficking. Wygant reported coming upon a massive egg-shaped object embedded in a cliff face in the Peruvian jungle. The object was partially buried, as if it had impacted at high speed. Before Wygant could investigate further, he was intercepted by a team of unmarked operators and a Department of Energy crew who secured the site and removed him from the area. A Department of Energy team, in a jungle in Peru, responding to a downed object during a military drug operation. Wygant's account was documented and has been referenced by UAP researchers as evidence that crash retrievals aren't limited to any single country or any single era. They're happening in real time, in locations that have nothing to do with the United States military's official UAP programs. South America, a continent rarely mentioned in mainstream UFO discussions, has its own history of encounters, military responses, and classified recoveries. Brazil's Varginha incident is the most documented case, but it's far from the only one. The Varginha files sit in Brazil's National Archives today. Thousands of pages, the full military inquiry, and, as of 2025, American officials are asking to see them, because whatever Brazil recovered in January 1996 might be part of the same story the U.S. government is only now beginning to tell. But while Brazil's encounter played out in daylight, another nation was watching from the shadows. And according to recently declassified files, they'd been in this race longer than anyone realized. Number 4. China. In June 2025, the U.S. government released its 3rd tranche of declassified UFO files. Buried in the data, and largely ignored by mainstream media, was a detail that should have made front-page news in every country on Earth. Jordan Flowers, executive director of the UAP Disclosure Foundation, read through the files and said publicly what intelligence officials had been hinting at for years. There is reason to believe that the Chinese and the Russians may have retrieved their own objects related to this and may have tried to reverse engineer them. And then he said the part that keeps defense analysts up at night. This is a race to see who can reverse engineer this first. The conversation had moved past whether the objects are real. This was a race between nations to be the first to crack technology that didn't originate on this planet. The real question is what happened behind closed doors, because the public statements only scratch the surface of what U.S. intelligence believes China is doing. David Grush, during his 2023 congressional testimony, told lawmakers that he had accessed intelligence reporting from what he described as a foreign peer adversary. The reporting detailed what that country believed the United States was doing with recovered UAP materials. Grush didn't name the country in the open hearing, but the implication, given the context of his testimony and the geopolitical framing, pointed directly at China. He stated his belief that China has dedicated resources to creating a UAP task force and is actively engaged in its own crash retrieval and reverse engineering efforts. I mean, think about that for a second. American intelligence accessed a foreign nation's internal intelligence about what that nation believed America was doing with alien technology, espionage about counter-espionage, about non-human craft, spy agencies spying on each other's UFO programs. The layers of secrecy involved in that single sentence are staggering. The Pentagon's own All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, added another data point. Their report designated the region stretching from western Japan across to China as a UAP sighting hotspot, one of the most active zones on the planet for unidentified aerial phenomena. That's not a coincidence. Hotspots tend to correlate with military testing, advanced aerospace activity, and, if the whistleblowers are right, with the locations where non-human objects are being recovered and studied. The Hill published an opinion piece titled, "Technology Surprise. Are China, Russia ahead of us in UFO retrieval, research?" The fact that a major American political publication is asking that question in print tells you how far the conversation has shifted. This isn't fringe territory anymore. This is national security analysis, and the question being asked at the policy level is whether the United States is winning or losing a technology race it hasn't officially acknowledged exists. Nell's warning about destabilization lands harder in this context. If one nation cracks propulsion, energy generation, or materials science that renders every existing military technology obsolete, the global balance of power shifts overnight. And that scenario is playing out right now, in 2025, with China dedicating resources, the U.S. running classified programs through defense contractors, and intelligence agencies on both sides tracking each other's progress. The publicly known details about China's program are thinner than what's available for the U.S. or Russia. That's by design. China's military and intelligence apparatus is among the most opaque on Earth. But the absence of public information doesn't mean the absence of activity. If anything, the fact that American intelligence officials are talking about China's program in congressional hearings suggests they've seen enough classified evidence to take it seriously. And the declassified files from June 2025, the ones Flowers referenced, add documentary weight to what was previously rumor. China is an active competitor in a race that could reshape the global balance of power. And the nation China is racing against? The one with the most evidence, the most whistleblowers, and the most programs on the public record? That's next. Number 5. The United States. July 26, 2023. A congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C. David Grush, a former senior intelligence officer who served on the Pentagon's UAP task force, raises his right hand and swears under oath to tell the truth about a program the Department of Defense says doesn't exist. And then he does. Grush told Congress that the United States has been running a multi-decade UAP crash retrieval and reverse engineering program. He testified that the program has recovered non-human origin technical vehicles. He said, "Non-human biological remains have been found." And he stated that he had been briefed on these programs by more than 40 witnesses across the U.S. government and defense contractor community, 40 people, across multiple agencies, all telling him the same thing. Under oath, on camera, in front of Congress, and the timing of what happened next? Almost too perfect. In November 2024, Grush returned for a second congressional hearing and confirmed everything he'd said the first time. But by then, a new detail had surfaced. A whistleblower had disclosed the existence of a program called Immaculate Constellation, a USAP, an unacknowledged special access program, created around 2017 to consolidate every piece of UAP intelligence the government had ever collected into a single classified repository. High-resolution photographs, full-motion video, infrared surveillance feeds, radar tracking data, measurement and signature intelligence, all of it funneled into one program that was never shared with Congress, never disclosed to the oversight committees that are legally required to know about it. A 12-page document describing Immaculate Constellation was handed to Representative Nancy Mace before the November 13, 2024 hearing. The Pentagon's response? They denied any record of a special access program by that name. If you're wondering how that's even legal, so is everyone else. But Grush and Immaculate Constellation are only part of the picture. Luis Elizondo, the former head of AATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, published a book in August 2024 called Imminent. It hit #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. In it, Elizondo claims that the United States holds recovered UAP material in secret reverse engineering programs run not through government labs, but through private defense contractors. He named them: Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Raytheon, BAE Systems, Battelle Memorial Institute. 6 of the largest defense corporations on the planet, allegedly running classified programs to reverse engineer non-human technology outside of normal government oversight. That claim connects to a story that goes back decades. In 1997, retired U.S. Army Colonel Philip Corso published The Day After Roswell, in which he claimed that he had personally distributed recovered artifacts from the 1947 Roswell crash to defense contractors on behalf of the Army. According to Corso, those artifacts led directly to the development of fiber optics, integrated circuits, night vision technology, Kevlar body armor, and laser systems. Technologies that reshaped the modern world. Technologies that, if Corso's account is accurate, didn't originate from human engineering. They were reverse engineered from recovered, non-human materials and seeded into the defense industrial pipeline. In 2024, Congress passed Section 9010 of the National Defense Authorization Act, granting the federal government legal authority to seize UFO-related technologies held by private entities. Read that again. Congress passed a law giving the government power to confiscate alien technology from private corporations. That's not a fringe bill. That's the NDAA, the annual defense spending legislation that funds the entire U.S. military. The provision exists because lawmakers believe, based on classified briefings they've received, that private companies are sitting on recovered materials. And then there's Carl Nell, retired Army colonel, former director-level position supporting the Pentagon's UAP task force. Speaking at the 2024 SALT iConnections conference, Nell laid out a 5-phase disclosure timeline. Phase 1, starting in 2024, prove UAPs exist. The final phase, projected for after 2034, engage with non-human intelligence. That's a sitting former military official presenting a decade-long roadmap for humanity's formal contact with non-human beings. At a finance conference, to an audience of investors. The United States is the most documented country on this list. Congressional testimony under oath, named programs, named contractors, named officials, whistleblower protections written into federal law, legislation authorizing the seizure of recovered technology, a former intelligence officer testifying about non-human remains, a former program director publishing a best-selling book about reverse engineering, a retired colonel presenting a disclosure timeline that ends with contact. In every other country on this list, the evidence comes through leaks and classified files. The U.S. has officials testifying on camera under oath. The volume of evidence has been building since 2023, and it shows no sign of slowing down. But the United States isn't operating alone, and the classified documents that prove it, they've already been released. Number 6. The United Kingdom. Somewhere in the 1990s, a classified briefing letter lands on a desk inside the British Ministry of Defence. It carries a classification marking that reads Secret UK ISB, meaning it's restricted to British intelligence personnel with specific clearances. The subject of the letter isn't a foreign military threat. It's not terrorism. It's not espionage. The subject is How to acquire propulsion technology from unidentified aerial phenomena that don't follow known physics. The letter states, in plain language, that UAPs do not appear to use conventional reaction propulsion. And then it says something no government memo should ever say if these objects are supposed to be birds, balloons, or weather anomalies. If this represents real technology, perhaps it should be acquired. A government memo, classified, suggesting that the United Kingdom should acquire alien propulsion, filed under secret. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected, because while the public debate in the US was still stuck on whether UFOs were real, British military intelligence was already past that question. They'd moved on to the operational question. How do we get the technology? The unit responsible was called DI-55, a section within the Directorate of Scientific and Technical Intelligence, itself nested inside the Defense Intelligence Staff. For decades, the Ministry of Defense refused to acknowledge that DI-55 even existed. When UFO researchers filed Freedom of Information requests asking about the unit, the MOD's standard response was to deny it. But DI-55 was real, it was active, and it compiled approximately 10,000 sightings and reports related to unidentified aerial phenomena over the course of its operation. 10,000 reports. From a unit the government said didn't exist. The declassified files from the 1990s paint a picture that goes beyond passive data collection. British military intelligence wasn't just cataloging sightings. They were analyzing them for military applications. Reports from that era describe large, silent, low-flying black triangles observed over British airspace, objects that prompted intelligence officials to seriously consider the possibility that someone, or something, had access to flight technology that the UK did not understand and could not replicate. Intelligence officials wanted to know how they could get their hands on whatever was producing them. Running parallel to DI-55's work was Project Condign, a classified study of unidentified aerial phenomena commissioned by the Ministry of Defense. The details of Condign remained hidden until the files were declassified and released through the National Archives. The study examined UAP reports, analyzed potential explanations, and assessed the defense implications of the phenomenon. It operated in secrecy for years while the MOD publicly maintained that UFOs posed no threat to national security and weren't worth investigating. The UK's involvement has a physical anchor point too. In December 1980, the Rendlesham Forest incident occurred near two active military bases, RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge, in Suffolk. Over 2 nights, military personnel reported seeing and approaching an unidentified craft in the forest between the bases. Deputy Base Commander Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt documented the incident in a formal memo, including radiation readings taken at the alleged landing site that showed significantly elevated levels. Halt himself witnessed multiple unidentified objects during the second night and recorded his observations on audio tape while they were happening. Rendlesham is sometimes called Britain's Roswell, and unlike most UFO cases, it comes with named military witnesses, a formal chain of command report, and physical measurements. Halt's memo is an official military document from a deputy base commander describing what he saw with his own eyes at a site where instruments registered anomalous readings. Put the pieces together and the pattern is clear. DI-55 compiled 10,000 reports. Project Condign ran a classified assessment. A secret UK ISB memo discussed acquiring non-human propulsion technology, and Rendlesham provided physical evidence from named military officers at an active NATO base. The UK wasn't casually curious about UAPs. The UK was running an intelligence operation to understand them and, based on the language in their own classified memos, to acquire the technology behind them. And the UK wasn't working alone. Britain is one of 5 nations in the most powerful intelligence-sharing alliance in the world, the Five Eyes: United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. If the UK was investigating UAP technology acquisition, their findings would flow through the same channels that share signals, intelligence, satellite data, and military assessments across all 5 nations. But the UK isn't the only Five Eyes partner with evidence of these programs, and the document that proves it came through official channels sent directly to a defense minister. Number 7. Canada. March 22, 2023. A confidential letter arrives at the office of Canadian Defense Minister Anita Anand. The sender is Larry Maguire, a sitting member of Parliament from Manitoba. The letter is detailed, specific, and makes claims that, if true, connect every country we've covered so far into a single coordinated system. McGuire's letter names a program called the Five Eyes Foreign Material Program. Five Eyes. The intelligence sharing alliance between the United States, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, and New Zealand. According to McGuire, this program exists specifically to analyze and reverse engineer exotic materials obtained from UFO crash recoveries. And some of those materials, according to the letter, date to the early 1950s. But Canada wasn't done yet, not even close. The letter goes further. McGuire states that Defense Research and Development Canada, DRDC, the Canadian military's own research arm, is in possession of recovered UAP material. He identifies the program as being sponsored by Canadian Forces Intelligence Command, CFINTCOM. He cites meetings with unnamed American officials as the source of his information, and he warns the defense minister directly. Get out in front of the UAP story before further revelations destroy public trust and embarrass the governments of the Five Eyes nations. That's not a conspiracy email sent to a tip line. That's a sitting member of the Canadian Parliament writing to the defense minister, on the record, naming specific programs, specific agencies, and specific materials. The letter was obtained by journalists Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp, and published through the Weaponized podcast. CBC News in Manitoba covered the story. And here's the part that matters most. The Canadian government responded. But read the response carefully, because the response is where the real story lives. The official response from Canada carefully denied that DRDC and CFINTCOM were involved in any such program. Carefully. They denied the specific agencies McGuire named. What they did not do is issue a broad denial of the program itself. They didn't say, no such program exists. They didn't say, Canada has never been involved in analyzing recovered UAP materials. They denied the specific institutional connections McGuire cited and left everything else untouched. That's not a typo, by the way. That's a non-denial denial. Investigative journalist Ross Coulthart analyzed the response publicly and flagged exactly this point. Important to note, Coulthart wrote, that the official Canadian response is not a denial. If McGuire's letter is accurate, then the Five Eyes Alliance, the most powerful intelligence-sharing network on the planet, has been running a coordinated program to collect, analyze, and reverse engineer recovered non-human materials since at least the early 1950s. That's over 70 years of five nations sharing infrastructure, intelligence, and materials through a multinational reverse engineering operation embedded inside the same intelligence framework that already shares satellite surveillance, signals intelligence, and military threat assessments across the English-speaking world. And that changes the math on every country we've already covered. Italy recovered something in 1933. Russia built underground facilities. Brazil conducted military operations. China is racing to catch up. The United States has multiple named programs and sworn testimony. The United Kingdom had DI-55 and classified memos about technology acquisition. But McGuire's letter connects them. The Five Eyes aren't separate programs operating in isolation. They're nodes in a network. And that network has been active for decades. If this is landing differently than you expected, subscribe. Because the next two countries on this list complete a picture most people have never seen. Enter Australia. And more specifically, a facility in the middle of the Australian desert that's been at the center of these claims for decades. The Five Eyes Foreign Material Program, if it exists as McGuire described, represents something larger than any single country's UFO program. It's an institutional architecture, a framework for moving recovered materials across international borders, analyzing them in shared facilities, and distributing findings through classified intelligence channels that bypass normal government oversight in every participating nation. Materials recovered by any Five Eyes member flow through a shared pipeline. Analysis conducted in one country is available to all five, and the entire system operates under classification levels that most elected officials in those countries don't have clearance to access. Larry McGuire sent his letter through official channels from a sitting MP directly to the defense minister, and the government's response, denying the specific agencies while leaving the broader program unaddressed, suggests that what McGuire described is close enough to the truth that a full denial would be a lie they weren't willing to tell. Number 8. Australia. 11 miles southwest of Alice Springs, in the red center of Australia, a cluster of white radomes rises from the desert floor. No commercial flight path crosses above the facility. The airspace is permanently restricted. The perimeter is patrolled, and the full scope of what happens inside has never been made public. This is Pine Gap. Officially called the Joint Defense Facility Pine Gap since 1988, it has been jointly operated by Australia and the United States since 1966. On paper, it's a satellite communications and signals intelligence surveillance base, one of the largest ground-based intelligence collection stations in the Southern Hemisphere. In practice, Pine Gap is one of the most secretive installations on the planet, and it sits at the center of claims connecting Australia to the global UAP reverse engineering story. But the version you've heard? That's not the full picture. Pine Gap's role in intelligence collection is well documented. The facility processes satellite data, tracks missile launches, and supports signals intelligence operations that feed directly into the Five Eyes network. It's staffed by both Australian and American personnel, and operates under a bilateral agreement that gives both nations access to the facility's capabilities. But UFO researchers and intelligence analysts have long pointed to Pine Gap as more than a listening post. In the context of Larry Maguire's letter naming a Five Eyes foreign material program, Pine Gap becomes a natural candidate for something more specific. A facility with restricted airspace, dual nation operation, massive underground infrastructure, and direct connections to the intelligence networks that would handle recovered UAP materials. The geographic logic is hard to ignore. Pine Gap sits in one of the most remote inhabited regions on Earth. The nearest city, Alice Springs, has a population of roughly 25,000. The surrounding desert is flat, open, and empty for hundreds of miles in every direction. If you were designing a facility to receive, store, and analyze materials that no unauthorized person should ever see, you'd build it exactly where Pine Gap sits. Isolated, restricted, jointly operated by two of the Five Eyes nations, and connected to every intelligence pipeline that matters. Australia's role in the Five Eyes extends beyond hosting facilities. As a full partner in the alliance, Australia participates in the same intelligence sharing agreements that govern the flow of signals intelligence, satellite data, and military threat assessments. If recovered UAP materials have been flowing through a Five Eyes foreign material program since the early 1950s, as Maguire's letter claims, then Australia has been part of that system for over 70 years. Not as a passive observer. As an active participant with its own intelligence infrastructure, its own analysts, and its own access to shared materials. The connection between Pine Gap and UAP research isn't new speculation. Researchers and journalists have flagged the facility for decades. Whitley Strieber's Unknown Country and the Weaponized podcast have both examined Pine Gap's potential role in UAP intelligence. UFO Research Queensland has documented sighting patterns in Central Australia that cluster around the facility's location. And the facility's very design, underground construction extending well below the desert surface, radome arrays consistent with satellite downlink reception, and restricted airspace enforced by military order, matches the profile of what a UAP material analysis facility would require. 5 nations, 1 program, materials dating to the 1950s, and a facility in the middle of nowhere with restricted airspace. The pattern looks deliberate. Australia doesn't have a Grush. It doesn't have congressional testimony or declassified memos about technology acquisition. What Australia has is Pine Gap, a joint facility that connects every thread in the Five Eyes story to a physical location in the Australian desert, a location with the security, the isolation, and the intelligence connections to serve as exactly the kind of node that a multinational reverse engineering program would need. The pattern across these 8 countries is becoming harder to dismiss as coincidence. Italy recovered a craft in 1933. Russia built underground facilities. Brazil's military deployed to capture living beings. China is racing to reverse engineer first. The US has sworn testimony and named programs. The UK's intelligence service wrote classified memos about acquiring the technology. Canada's parliamentary letter named the alliance. And now Australia provides the physical infrastructure that ties the Five Eyes together. But the Five Eyes aren't the only ones paying attention anymore, and the newest player in this race entered the game just months ago. Number 9. Japan. May 2025. Members of a Japanese parliamentary league walk into the office of Defense Minister Gen Nakatani, carrying a formal proposal. The proposal calls for the Ministry of Defense to establish a dedicated UAP department with 3 specific tasks: collect and analyze UAP data, disclose findings to the public, and report regularly to the National Diet, Japan's legislature. This isn't a fringe petition from backbenchers. This is an organized parliamentary group making a formal request to the sitting defense minister to build new military infrastructure around a phenomenon that, until recently, most governments wouldn't even acknowledge. The group calls itself the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Clarification League for Security-Oriented National Security. It was formed in 2024 by sitting members of parliament, and it's chaired by 2 lawmakers who claim to have personally witnessed unidentified aerial phenomena. Not second-hand reports, not constituent letters. 2 elected officials stating publicly that they've seen UFOs with their own eyes and are now using their legislative positions to demand their government investigate. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything. The timing of Japan's entry into this story isn't random. The AARO report, the same Pentagon assessment that mapped global UAP activity, designated the region from western Japan across to China as one of the most active UAP sighting hotspots on the planet. Japan doesn't just share a geographic neighborhood with a major UAP corridor. Japan sits inside it. And the Japanese defense establishment, which maintains one of the most technologically advanced military forces in the Pacific, has apparently decided that ignoring the phenomenon is no longer an option. The Parliamentary League's stated mission isn't subtle. They want Japan to track and investigate UAP data and share information with the United States. That last part is significant. Japan isn't proposing to study this in isolation. They're proposing to plug into the American intelligence framework that's already generating congressional testimony, whistleblower protections, and declassified files. They want in on whatever the U.S. knows. And given Japan's status as one of America's closest military allies in the Pacific, with U.S. bases stationed across the country and joint defense agreements that date back to 1952, that request carries real weight. Consider Japan's position in this race. The country that gave the world the transistor radio, the bullet train, precision robotics, and some of the most advanced materials, science, and semiconductor manufacturing on Earth is now formally entering the UAP investigation space. Japan's industrial base, its research universities, its defense technology sector, all of it makes Japan one of the most capable nations on the planet when it comes to the technical challenge of analyzing and reverse engineering unknown materials. If any country outside the Five Eyes has the infrastructure to contribute meaningfully to understanding recovered non-human technology, Japan is near the top of that list. The 2025 timing matters for another reason. Every other country on this list has a story rooted in history. Italy's crash was in 1933. Russia's program started in the 1950s. Brazil's Varginha incident was in 1996. Even the U.S. whistleblower wave started in 2017 with the release of the AATIP videos. Japan's entry is happening right now, in real time. A parliamentary league formed in 2024. A formal proposal delivered to the defense minister in May 2025. Public statements from elected officials about personal sightings. This isn't a declassified file from 40 years ago. This is a country deciding, right now, that it needs to be part of this conversation. There's another angle here that matters. Japan sits in the most active UAP corridor identified in the AARO report, the region stretching from western Japan to mainland China. The same zone that has produced the densest cluster of sightings in the Pentagon's global data set. If sightings correlate with activity, and if activity correlate with recoveries, then Japan's geographic position alone makes it a front-row seat to whatever is happening in the Pacific. The Japanese self-defense forces maintain some of the most advanced radar and sensor networks in Asia. If something enters Japanese airspace that doesn't match any known aircraft, they would know about it. And the pace is accelerating. CBS News, News Nation, Defense Blog, and the South China Morning Post all covered Japan's parliamentary league and the formal proposal to the defense ministry. International media is treating Japan's move as a signal that the global conversation about UAPs has shifted from "are they real" to who's investigating them and how fast. 9 countries deep, spanning 92 years, from a fascist telegram in 1933 to a parliamentary proposal in 2025. Each one adding to a pattern that started looking deliberate somewhere around country 4 and, by country 9, looks undeniable. But the most extraordinary claim in this entire story didn't come from a whistleblower or a leaked document. It came from a man who ran an entire nation's space program for 3 decades. And what he said makes everything you've just heard sound tame. Number 10. Israel, December 2020. Israel's largest daily newspaper, Yedioth Ahronoth, publishes an interview that reads like the plot summary of a science fiction movie. The source is Professor Haim Eshed, who spent nearly 30 years as the head of Israel's security space program. The man who ran Israel's most classified satellite and space defense initiatives for 3 decades sat for a newspaper interview and said, flatly, that aliens are real. And this is where the story takes its strangest turn. Eshed went straight to it. He said, a galactic federation exists. He said aliens have been in contact with both the United States and Israel. He said they conduct experiments on Earth. And then he said something that landed like a shockwave across every intelligence community that was paying attention. He claimed there is a joint base underground on Mars, where aliens collaborate with American astronauts. That's not a retired hobbyist at a UFO convention. That's the equivalent of the head of NASA going on the record in a major national newspaper and saying there's an alien base on Mars and his country has been in contact with the beings who built it. Eshed went further. He said the reason none of this has been disclosed publicly is that the aliens themselves requested secrecy. The unidentified flying objects have asked not to publish that they are here, Eshed told the newspaper. Humanity is not ready yet. He elaborated on these claims in his book, The Universe Beyond the Horizon, which was published in Hebrew and received coverage in Israel but drew limited attention from English-language media until NBC News. Futurism, SYFY Wire, and the Times of Israel all picked up the story. Step back and consider who this man is. Haim Eshed sat at the center of Israel's defense establishment for 3 decades. He received the Israel Defense Prize 3 times, the highest honor for contributions to national security and defense technology. He launched spy satellites. He built the intelligence architecture that Israel relies on for strategic warning and missile defense. When the head of a program at that level speaks publicly, the defense community listens, even when what he's saying sounds impossible. And that's the uncomfortable part. You can dismiss a random whistleblower. You can question the motives of a junior intelligence officer. But Haim Eshed spent 30 years running programs so classified that most Israeli citizens don't know they exist. He has nothing to gain from fabricating claims at the end of his career. The man is in his 90s. He wrote a book, gave an interview, and said what he said. Either he's lost his mind after a flawless 30-year career at the highest levels of Israeli intelligence, or he's telling the truth about what he saw and was told during those 30 years. The Western media largely treated the story as comic relief when it first broke. A few outlets ran it under weird news. Most ignored it. But in Israel's defense and intelligence circles, Eshed's statements landed differently. This was not some retired general making vague claims over dinner. This was the architect of Israel's space surveillance capability. A man whose professional judgment had been trusted with the nation's strategic defense for 3 decades, putting his name and reputation behind claims that would end most careers. The claims about Mars, about a galactic federation, about alien requests for secrecy, these sound like science fiction, but place them in the context of everything else on this list. Italy recovered a craft in 1933. Russia stored wreckage underground for decades. Brazil's military captured living beings. China is racing to reverse engineer non-human technology. The United States has sworn congressional testimony from multiple named officials. The United Kingdom wrote classified memos about acquiring alien propulsion. Canada named a Five Eyes program for sharing recovered materials. Australia houses a joint facility that connects the network. Japan formed a parliamentary league in 2025 to investigate. And now the man who ran Israel's space program for 30 years says there's a galactic federation and humanity isn't ready for what's coming. 10 countries. 92 years. From a fascist telegram in 1933 to a Japanese parliamentary proposal in 2025. Officials from inside these programs are speaking publicly now, under oath, in books, in newspapers, at finance conferences. Whatever is happening, it's accelerating. And the people who spent their careers inside the most classified programs on the planet are choosing to talk. Carl Nell's 5-phase disclosure timeline is in phase 1. The man who ran Israel's space program for 30 years says humanity isn't ready yet. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments, because wherever you are, the country you're sitting in might be next. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes after this.